All right, we're live. So welcome to the second Power Hour. We're going to do a bunch of PowerShell community lightning talks. I don't want to take any of the time, so we're going to get right to the content. Let me just introduce our first speaker. We have Sandra Stodd.
So welcome everybody. I am gonna talk about a cloning module for SQL Server I made a couple of months ago, which helps DBAs or system administrators to provision databases that are too large to just back up and restore to other database servers. Actually, to make such a clone, like it only takes about 300 megabytes, and you can clone databases up to 64 terabytes. So that's kind of why I built this. I have a procedure at my current workplace and wasn't efficient enough. So I thought, let's just create something we can use. Let's dive right in how it actually works in the background. It does what it does. It uses the VHD functionality of Hyper-V. It creates a VHD, attaches it to a host, and then it restores a database inside that VHD, closes it, and then you have your so-called image. After that, you can create a differencing disk. In this context, it's going to be named clone. And it only saves the delta. So anything you change in that clone is only going to represent in that clone, but doesn't represent into that image. So you can clone to 100 different machines and still have the same base. So let's see how that actually works. So I have made a video to make sure all the gremlins are out of this. So the command is called new PSDC image, and I'm gonna assign the source SQL instance, which is SQL DB1, assign a credential, and tell it to go to the same server. You can use a different database server to, if it's a production server, you don't want to do all those restores on the production server, so you can use another server that has access to that particular database. Then I set the destination credential for the SQL Server and then a destination credential for the share. These images need to be written to a share because that's the whole point of it. You want all the servers that are using the clones that they can reach the image. So I select the database and say create a new field backup. It's creating the image. And it takes a couple seconds and it's done. You have the image. So the next part is to create the clone. So the command is new PSDC clone. Okay, we're going to go to another instance, SQL DB3. Set the location. Give it a name. And I'm also going to say, okay, use the latest image. So we just created that image for that particular database, and you can just say, okay, just do the latest image, hit enter, put some credentials in to make sure everything works. And let's go. And there's the clone. Let's look at that last part for a bit to show you how that works. It looks like. So it's written to this path, and on this server, this is the name, and it's enabled. This is the original image name, etc., etc. So if we start to look at the servers, this is my original server with this database, and it's got a couple tables in it. And if I go to my destination server, I can see that I have the DB1, C1 with the same tables in there. And I can create a new table. Just call it something. Doesn't really matter how. Normally I would just use T-SQL. Refresh it. And I got my table 1. But if I look at the database where it originally came from, I don't see the same table. So if I start to look at the server, this is my image. So this is my database server SQL DB1. This is the image I created. And with the command get psdc image, I can see all the images I created. If I look at the database server, which actually has the clone, I can see in my disk management that I got a 64 terabyte VHD. It's not 64 terabyte in size. That's the maximum size it can grow to. Make sure you have that space if you ever want to use that. And I have my path to my data. This is actually the MDF and the data file, and this is the log file of that database inside that path. And this is the PhD that's mounted. So I can also get the PCC clone. This is the clone we created. Same information we got in the video, but you can still get it with the command. And if we look at the database, you can see that it is actually the clone, because it points to this directory, which I showed you that the data and log was in there. So within a couple minutes, I clone the database. I create an image, clone the database to another server, and I can do all kinds of testing with it. I can attach or create procedures, test different functionality with I can create multiple clones from the same image on the same machine. Do anything with that.
About the 2-minute mark, just a heads up.
Okay, almost done. If you want more information how to use it, I created some documentation. Go to psdatabaseclone.org. I wrote some documentation. There are some videos in there how to use it. It's an open source project. It's on GitHub. It's going to get a new release very soon with that we don't have to use Hyper-V anymore. It still uses some Hyper-V functionality. So we want to get rid of that. If you want to participate in this project, you're welcome to do that. That was it.
Awesome. Thanks, Eder. So next up, we have Ryan.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, so I'm here to talk to you about PowerShell getters and setters today. It's a feature that we generally associate more with real development tools. However, PowerShell has classes available to us, and I use them quite frequently. So I've took the time to get my implementation of this tool in here. Very briefly, my name's Ryan. I blog at dftai.ch. I say almost never because I've been quite busy lately. I've had a child and I'm going to get married day after tomorrow. And yeah, the DFTI, if anyone was curious, stands for don't forget to automate it. So that's that. When we're talking about accessors are a way that we can access our properties from a class or an object that we've created. So like I say, it's a way to control access to properties or methods in a class or function. This is generally through the means of a get or a set. So we'll talk about the getters first. You can use getters to control what data gets returned from a particular object. Sounds super obvious, but we could use it to do something like generate calculated properties. So in this example here, I'm returning the first name and the full name and the surname to create the full name object. So that's an example of a getter. Setters, in contrast, are the opposite. You can use setters to control what data gets written to a particular variable or property, sorry. This could be something as simple as trimming your white space from the input object before it gets written. It could be something as complicated as making sure that it's the right format or that it exists in the database already, that it's valid data. You can do all these sorts of tests before the property gets actually set. So I'm trying to show you this now, but unfortunately it actually doesn't even exist. We can't use accessors in PowerShell. There's no native way to do this today. There is something already, there's an issue raised in the GitHub repo for PowerShell to enable this functionality, but it hasn't made much progress yet. So you're thinking, why are you bothering me, Ryan, with this topic? And it's because I have a workaround. And my workaround is to use script properties and the hidden tag of PowerShell classes. So without further ado, that's all of the literature I'm going to bore you with today. Let's jump into the demo. So here, I'm just going to show you a very basic example of a class that I wrote. Here, I'm just importing the class. You can see here in the background, very simple class. It has a property on it, the internal property, which is hidden. This means that PowerShell can't see it, or the users themselves can't see it by default. And then what I've got here is two separate properties here, a writable and a readable. The writable has a set defined. And what I do is, like I say, I trim it and then I write it to the internal property. For my get, I just return the value of the internal property. So let's jump back here. I'm going to import my module, create an instance of my class. And if I run this here, I should be able to see that, hopefully that's not too small for people online. I have the readable and writable property, but I don't have the internal property. If we go a bit further along, we can see setting the readable property is actually impossible. If I try and set it, I actually get an exception back saying this property is not settable. However, if I try to set the writable property, everything works. And in the opposite case, if I try and read from the writable property, I don't get anything back. It's not readable. I would like to have an exception here, but there's a bug that I can't get it to work right now. If we move on, if I try to read the readable property, I can see I have the new value that's been set by setting the writable property. And just to double check that my trim functionality works, I can implement a feature of pester here to say readable should be true, or should be this new value, and it didn't fail, so we know it's good. But like I said, there's a very tricky part here. This hidden keyword only allows us to hide things on a very superficial level. If I actually query the property directly, you can see I can actually get the value out. And if I set the internal property directly, I can do that as well. And it doesn't implement my trim functionality because that's a function of my setter. So if I try and read out the readable property and test it with pester, theoretically it should be this value, but it's not, because it doesn't trim off the last bit of my string as it's supposed to. So that's a very basic example of how to get it working. A more appropriate use case, let's say, is I've got a user class. So I'm going to import my base class here, and here I've defined a user class which has two very simple properties. It has a username and a password, and I've defined a constructor here. For people who aren't familiar with PowerShell classes, please do look up on Microsoft Docs. They are super useful for storing data, for controlling things on a very granular level. I use them quite often in conjunction with functions PowerShell generally. So don't be don't worry if you don't understand the syntax. It's quite simple, and you can look it up in Microsoft Docs. So I've just defined a constructor here which accepts username and password. It's like a function to create this object, and I set the properties here. So I've defined the class now. If I execute it, I can see my password is actually queryable, which is not good, but I shouldn't necessarily want to be able to do that. So we use the implementation that I've made of my getters and setters. I have now a secure version of my class. It actually implements a secure string to make it even more secure. But what I've done here is to just define a set, and the set allows me to set the value that I'm passing to it, to this underscore password hidden property. And because I've only defined a set, I can't get it back out again. So let's just execute this class here. And this time I'm gonna hide my password so you can't see it. So, super secure. And if I run it now, you pull the password out, you don't get anything back. So super secure. However, sadly, like I say, the underscore password is still available to us. So if I query this back out again, you do see my password. It's a tiny bit obfuscated. It's super easy to get that back out again. But yeah, what I can also do is I can just keep resetting this password. Because the set is there, I can continually reset my password, as it were, reset, new password. And if I query the password back out again, you can see the last digits are different. So it is actually been reset. Let's go back to actually how I've implemented all this. We can see here I've got my base class. This is the driving piece behind everything.
About 2-minute warning to step away.
Thank you. Yeah. I've defined these two classes which are inherit from the attribute class, and this basically is a complicated way of saying that I can do this little square bracket business here. And yeah, I have a single string which is accepted, which is my script block, which gets executed. And when you implement the base object, which is what you see here, when I've said my secure object implements base object, I automatically in the background loop through all of your properties that you have on there and check, does it contain a get? Does it contain a set? And if it does, then I use regex to take out your bit of code that you want to execute, and I add a script property. So I say add member script property. I give it the same name that you gave it before. I gave it the same property type you gave it before, and then I assign the get, and I assign the set, and then I forcibly overwrite that property name. And at the end of the day, what you get is the emulated functionality of the getters and setters. So in summary, I would say, please use PowerShell classes. They are a very good way to store data, like I said, to add additional functionality. You can use this inheritance method to gain control how your code is split everywhere. And if you need this functionality of getters and setters, please look at my code. I've uploaded it to the materials folder in our PS PowerHour repo. And thank you very much for listening. Have a good evening.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So next up, we have Teresa.
Right. Hi everyone, my name is Teresa Clark. I've lived and worked in the UK, London, for over 15 years. I went to uni in New Zealand, and shown are my qualifications. Today I'm talking about how I use PowerShell to solve a problem. And I was part of a multidisciplinary team with a couple of projects. One of them was to decommission servers. The target servers were 2003 automatic decoms, 2008 and 2012 boxes. We needed more information, and this was due to server appropriation and ownership drift. We needed to understand how the servers were being used and confirm the decommission approval. Constraints were, I was new to the company and there's limited server access. Company had a large enterprise, was a large enterprise and was siloed by business and technical groups. It was difficult to navigate, and also I had no database for data storage and analysis. So the plan was to utilize Blade Logic. Blade Logic is used to install software and patches on servers. PowerShell version 3. This was the lowest common denominator on the 2012 and 2008 boxes. Focus on the commands WMI, which is read-only, export CSV, which pipes results to a spreadsheet, which meant I didn't have to use a database. Then the decom profile included last reboot, which is a good indication of server management for Windows, and also 5 user logins. And the script was tested under dev and change control, and I was allocated a Blade Logic resource. And lastly, with the script, I put a timeout loop. This was due to a lack of visibility when running code via an agent. In serverless computing, such as AWS Lambda, there is a timeout value. And I'm just going to quickly show 2 of the WMI commands that were in the script. So it's more presentation than a demo. So here's a first example, the last reboot. See at the top the WMI command, and then it's piped through export CSV to a file. In green are the properties that were referenced or in the results. And in blue, I'm showing the date and time formatting as information was collected from servers globally. These were in different time zones and display formats. And so I need to reconfigure them so you could compare them in the results. The second example is the 5 last user logins. Again, in green, the properties that appear in the resulting file. In blue, I've highlighted some of the filtering. The main reason the WMI commands are quite large is due to sanitizing. And this is due to, well, there's 2 trains of thought. You can either scrape all the data and then dump it into a database for further analysis. But what I did was filter and sanitize the data, and then results are piped cleanly into a spreadsheet and no further work is required. In this example here, the SIDS system, local service, and local network are filtered out. So you're focusing on the user logins. And then as an overview, here's the information gathering pipeline. Blade Logic runs the PowerShell script locally on the servers, which is great. That meant that you didn't have to configure remote access. Then the Blade Logic agent copied the files to a central repository. And then from there, I ran another script which collated many files into one. And I put a generic copy of this PowerShell script on GitHub. So the final resulting file shows each decom attribute as a worksheet. Overall data is clean, tidy, and ready for making business decisions. And then a final word. I've learned a lot about DevSecOps lately, so I just thought I'd throw this in. It's more about a methodology of working, culture of sharing, and collaboration across teams. I think it would have helped with some of the constraints I faced during this project. These slides are from Mohammed Imran. And finally, thank you everyone. Contact via PowerShell Slack workspaces. And yeah, thank you Warren and Michael.
Yay, thank you, Teresa. So next up we have Claudio.
Hey, thank you, Warren, and thank you, Michael, to putting this together. So today I will share a solution I came out for a problem I was dealing with in a customer. So first of all, my name is Claudio Silva. I'm a SQL Server DBA and a PowerShell MVP. I contribute for DBA tools and DBA checks PowerShell modules, and I usually speak in several SQL Server and PowerShell conference. So the problem I get on the client is converting SQL code from one flavor to another. So this case from a Firebird database engine to the SQL Server engine. And as you can imagine, converting large amounts of code can be really painful, almost because the code and all the functions are not the same with the same names. And when we are talking about 60,000 lines of code with more than 1,000 of objects, this will become very awful to do by hand, and I only have 6 months for the project. So as a quick example, when we see in the Firebirds using the starting function, we need to translate to T-SQL with like, and because it's the starting, we need to add to our conversion the percentage character. On the more complex example, I have seen some triggers with this kind of code, and Firebird here make it very simple because we only need to affect the columns that we want to change. And for the ones that work with SQL Server, you know that we need something like this. So we need to insert on the table and specify every single column from the inserted table. So what was my approach? I decided to create a find and replace function that accepts the regular expressions, and I decided to use a hash table so I can provide multiple inputs and at once do all the replace and save the file again. And then with that, I can run it for each file. Some of the advantage of this, all the advantages that we know we can get with PowerShell and with automation. So it's a heavily repetitive task, and I can eliminate some error-prone errors. So here, I didn't reinvent the wheel. I searched on Google for some function, and I come to a gist from Bill Stewart. So I pick it and I wrote it as a set expression function. I added my hash table as parameter so I can do something like this. And the other change was to open the file once, do all the replace, and save it. The way that the function on the begin works is just a single replace. So with this in mind, I have here some examples. So let me show you. I have this table on my database with these 3 columns. And for instance, I have this view on the Firebird's SQL codes. As you can see here, is underlining saying that I have some errors because these are not the correct syntax for T-SQL. And what I have done is something like this. So I have a replacements hash table ordered, and this is important because of the order that we'll do when we are working with multiple replace. And I learn a lot about regular expressions, and I come up with some of them. And if I run this for my view, I will replace only this. On the output, I'm running through all the iterations so I can see where I am. And if I come back to my if I refresh, now I have a T-SQL TSQL codes that now make me able to come here, format the codes, compile, and confirm that everything is working as I expect. So another demo was like the store procedures. We work with parameters, and in that case, the Firebird codes use this syntax, and so you can say that a specific parameter or variable can be of a type of a column, and you can say which column from which table. And what I have done here was I have used the SQL Server metadata to generate my replace. So I can come here, do the pastes of these ones, and when I run for the store procedure, and this is just one file, but it can be for all the ones that we want, I will have the replace. And as you can see here, now I have the proper TSQL syntax, and now I can come here and do the last 5% of work that I need to do to make it work. The same from the triggers. So the triggers is an example that will generate a lot of codes in comparison with the Firebird code. I have generated also. So in this case, for the triggers, I have for my tables, I generate for the before insert triggers and the after by copying and paste this to my hash table. I can run for the trigger, and it will change all the necessary if I select it correctly this way. Sorry, I have here an error. And finally, for the last demo, I can pick the files from the folder and iterate for each file and run the replacements. So the outcome with this approach was that I made in like 2 weeks the work that will need several months. And so you can see on the first meeting we have, the client said, "You work too fast for us." And I say, "Thank you, PowerShell, for that." So in my contacts, I will upload the demos, and hope you like it. Thank you, Warren. Thank you, Michael.
Awesome. Thanks, Claudio. So next up, we have Sean.
Oh, I had to unmute all my speakers. Oh, I'm Sean Melton. I'm going to do an intro to Visual Studio. I'm sure a lot of folks have already heard about this. If you're on Twitter or you follow Microsoft a good bit, a lot of people have been sharing the greatness that is Visual Studio Code on Twitter and other social medias. But I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough of just the basics of what it is and specific on PowerShell development. That's all my contacts. I'm on Twitter and on SQL Community Slacks and a PowerShell Slack as well. Major contributor for DBA Tools project, and I'm also a Microsoft MVP. So there's 2 builds that go with Visual Studio. The stable one is your standard one that a lot of folks will use in production. The Insider Edition is going to be your beta release. That is the one that Insider is actually released just about every day to a certain extent. I lost my screen go. There it is. Insider is released generally about every day, sometimes every week. I've had 2 releases come out within a single day before. Stable, you're going to see releases for that one every month, generally around the first week of the month. They'll release that. The current version right now, I think, is 1.27.0. For the Insiders build, there is an actual non-admin installer that when I publish the links or the slides for this, there'll be a link where you can go find. It's hidden in the documentation right now. By default, the installer that you download from the download site require administrative privileges to install it. And it was one of the top voted issues, I think, on VS Code that they finally came out with a non-admin installer that is basically just installs to your profile. There are also some advanced options that you can actually install a portable version of VS Code on a USB stick if you want to go that far. So the general interface, I stripped this photo off of the documentation site. The left-hand side, when you open up Visual Studio Code, this is an activity bar. This is slowly growing as extensions are released. Somewhere around, I believe it was version 1.25, VS Code added API ability where you could actually write your extension to display data on an activity bar on the side panel here. And there's a few extensions that I know some of these are extensions, and there's some Git extensions that use it as well, that you'll slowly see this build out. The main section here in the middle, up at the top, is going to be your editor groups. That's where you'll open files and work with the text and everything. This option, as of, I think it's 2.6 release, you've got actually a grid layout, so you can actually have a 4-square layout with top left, top right, bottom right view of files. The panel area, that's where you access the terminal, the debug console, so most of the output for when you're doing debugging. The output panel, I'll show that in a little bit more detail in a minute. And then problems. The problems is based off of the extensions that you're using. An example, PowerShell extension has use of PS Script Analyzer built into it. So if one of the rules in PS Script Analyzer is broken, it'll show up as a problem item for that file within this problems panel. Your status bar down on the bottom. The bottom left where it shows that master, those three are going to always be there. That is referenced for Git integration when you're working with Git projects. Anything after that is strictly based off of what extensions you're using. I'll have a few that I open that are running when I open up Visual Studio Code. You'll see it'll populate some more down there. And then on the right-hand side, it's the basic, pretty much same thing you get in Notepad++. It'll give you the line of your current cursor, the column. The spaces can be either spaces or tabs, and then it'll give you the encoding of the file. That JSON that it shows right there, you can actually click on that and change it, the format that you want of the file. By default, when you open VS Code, it'll open up as plain text. But if you want to write PowerShell code, you can set it to PowerShell. If you're writing JSON, you can set it to JSON and such. There's a handful of different formatters that are built into it. The zooming feature is a lot of presenters use this one. It's very effective, and for visually, if you just have, I tend to keep mine pretty zoomed because I have to read with glasses and such, and it just makes it easier to read. But you can zoom the environment, so that zooms the menus. Pretty much everything you see will get bigger. They added an option within the last 2 releases that you can now zoom your editor text. So it's just within that editor will zoom, and the side panels and all of that stuff will stay normal. For extensions, VS Code itself, you obviously extend the features that you want. Pretty much use of extensions. There's a few ways to get the extensions. The marketplace, you can go to marketplace.visualstudio.com/VS Code. You can search through all of the READMEs. It'll give you most of the VS Code extensions have pages that explain what the extension's for. They may have screenshot examples, and so a little bit of a documentation on how to use them. There's an activity bar within VS Code that you can also do. You download extensions and install them This gives you the option to disable and enable them if you need to. And then you can also use VSIX files and install them more or less in a manual sense. This is the same format file that Visual Studio uses as well, if you're familiar with those extensions with Visual Studio. Common thing I use them for is generally if a new release came out for an extension, the extension updated, but it broke something, and I need to roll it back. I'll go download the previous version VSIX file and install that one in a manual manner, and it rolls the extension back for me. There are some extensions that are released on GitHub that don't show up in the marketplace. Microsoft will do that for some things. That you go to the repository on GitHub, download the VSIX file, and then add that as well.
About 2 minutes left.
Already? So you can also do the command line installation. I've got an example link for a one-liner for doing that I tweeted a few weeks ago. The settings in VS Code, you have user settings and workspace settings. User settings are overall for the environment. Workspace settings are when you open up a specific folder within VS Code, you can have specific settings that pertain just to that workspace. The command palette is something that you'll commonly use. A lot of the extensions, when they have commands specific to their extension, it's going to usually start with that name. The Git integration within Visual Studio Code, you type Git, and it'll show you all the commands that are available for that. These are the common extensions for specifically to PowerShell development that I've used. The code spell checker is obviously just spell checker. It does support camel casing, so if you've got two words put together in their camel case with the first letter capitalized, it won't pick it up as a misspelled word. Settings syncs lets you sync all of your settings in your user settings file up to a gist in GitHub. So if you do multiple devices, you can easily sync those down. The VS Live Share is in public preview, but it gives you the option to do collaboration online with people via, like, you're sitting in VS Code and you could share that environment with somebody else. The PowerShell extension specifically is based off of PowerShell editor services. This is a separate project on GitHub, but the integrated terminal that you use within VS Code is a custom host that the PowerShell editor services builds when it starts. Then you also have debugging options. So this is the PowerShell debugger, same thing that you would use with PowerShell ISE. And that's pretty much all of that. Let me show you one.
We are at time.
Okay.
We're going to go ahead and roll over. So next up is Carol.
All right. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Hope so.
Yep.
Perfect. So I'm going to talk about a new module that has been developed lately, and I have been fortunate enough to work on this for the last 5 months or so, or even more. And it's about deploying databases or continuously deploying databases. The module is called DBOps. And some information about me: I'm a SQL Server DBA for a long time now. Right now, I'm working at Wawanese Insurance in Canada. I'm a major contributor to DBA tools. At least Chrissy says I'm a major contributor, so who am I to disagree with her? I'm a big fan of any kind of automation and continuous integration deployment. And also, I think PowerShell and Jenkins are pretty good together. The module is designed to continuously deploy the SQL code, and it's powered, and the libraries that are used inside this module are pretty sturdy, and all the time that I use them, I have never seen any issues with the libraries themselves. The libraries are called DBUp, and it's quite popular .NET project, but usually only developers work with it because it's it has quite complicated syntax inside, and you need to know a lot about the classes structure and everything. So the idea was to build a module that would be using all of those features and some of the other features added on top of that, and provide a easy experience for any user who wants to deploy their SQL code in a reliable manner. It supports stuff like build system. It has some basic pipelining features. Most importantly, it's cross-platform, so you can use it on SQL Server. You can use it on Oracle, and going forward, there's about 5 or 6 other RDBMS which I'm planning to bring on board. And it's also, since it's a deployment module, it's tested pretty thoroughly. And as of right now, I have like 340 pressure tests for it. One of the main things about database deployments is journaling. So every deployment should be stored somewhere in the database, and it's a table, obviously. That table helps us to check whether the code has already been deployed. That thing also helps us to find the deployment order and stuff like that. So this is the idea of the deployment package that I'm using inside the module. So every package has a build inside, which in turn comprises of several scripts, which in this case, build 1.0 would be deployed, would not be deployed to the database A because this database has already version 1.0. Inside the database, there is a schema versions table which contains the records for each script that has been executed against it, and build 1.0 is completely covered by it. So that means if we try to deploy that package into this database, only builds 1.1, 0.2, and 0.3 will be deployed. Similarly, the same way, this database will only get 2 last builds, and this empty database will get all of them in a proper order. All right, this is the short introduction, and I'll start with my demo. So I'm a big fan of VS Code, but I didn't have VS Code on my server environment, so don't blame me. I'll start with a cleanup. It's a good idea to have your lab prepared. And I'll start with configuration. So every time you do the deployment, there is a default settings that you can use during that deployment. And you can also have some control on top of that. So right now, the default SQL instance that I'm using is a local host. You can override it anytime, but this is like default configuration, right? So application name, the way you will see your connection, deployment method, transaction without any additional transactions and other stuff. So I'm going to change my default setting for the database that I'm going to use. So right now it's empty. I'm going to set it to dbops. So now we have dbops as a default setting for all of the commands. All right, let's do some deployments first. I'm going to invoke a simple deployment from the scripts that are located in this particular folder on the SQL instance localhost database dbops. All right, done. So all the scripts have executed successfully. It reported that certain scripts have been deployed. We can also check how the stuff looks like inside here. And one of the most important things is the schema version table, which contains the history of our deployment. So if we check it real quick, what's inside, we will see that there's all of our scripts here in the proper order and the deployment time. So let's do another attempt and deploy it from the relative source. So right now you see here the previous scripts, they used an absolute path, which probably is not the best way to do because that absolute path would actually end up in your database. So let's switch to the folder with the scripts and do a quick deployment from the relative path. So pretty much the same stuff. You will see the same database deployed to the server, and all the tables are here, including the schema version table, which now contains all the records that we want it to contain. So now that we want, for example, to build on top of that and deploy the scripts that have not been yet deployed, we can copy those scripts to the same location. Those 2 files have been just copied there. And I'm just running the same exact deployment, but due to the journaling, we would only see the 2 latest scripts deployed because the other ones have already been deployed, and that way we can ensure that the deployment is reliable and none of the scripts will be executed this second time, twice. But what if we actually want the script to be executed twice? What if there are same names that developers have provided us, and the scripts are usually have the same names like tables.sql, procedures.sql, and we still want to do the migrations. So in this case, this module introduces a packaging and build system. So I'm going to switch to the empty folder and create a new package inside of it from the scripts in the same folder using a certain build number. So this command created a zip file, and it's a regular zip file inside, but with some peculiar content. So this is some metadata about the package. This is the deployment script that you can just execute after unzipping the package, and it will just deploy it. And in content, you can see build 1.0, where we can see all the scripts that have been added to the package. So I'm just going to upload this package into a variable package, and you can see it has quite a few options in it, including stuff like builds, and one of the more important and most important things that I'm proud of is the number of methods. And behind the scenes, this package is actually a PowerShell, native PowerShell class, which we are fortunate to have in PowerShell 5.0, where all the methods can
about 2 minutes, FYI.
Got it. So I'm just going to deploy this. Sorry, I'm just going to add some more scripts to the existing variable from this folder. You can see there are builds 2.0 now here with the 2 new scripts. You can get the details about the scripts here. You can get their contents using the methods. And you can deploy the variable and the object that's contained in this variable onto the server. Speaking of configuration, any package has its own internal configuration that is stored inside the package. So we can update any of this configuration using, for example, hash tables. And now we can, we just updated the deployment meant to SQL transaction, and here it is. We can use hash tables to provide during installation part. So you can override the configuration using hash tables. Boom, something blew up. And this is because before that, we used the deployment log table as a schema versions. But right now, we are using a different configurations, and the script tried to be deployed twice because the schema version table name was different. So we tried to deploy in the schema version. Now we're changing it, saving it to the JSON file. So this is a simple JSON file. I know you guys like Notepad. And we're using that JSON file to install the stuff. It just tells us everything is already there. No new scripts to be executed.
About
Done.
30 seconds.
Got it. So there is a whole bunch of the CI stuff that you can run. For example, you can just keep adding the scripts to the folder and keep running this command, and it will dynamically add the scripts to your package, and it would dynamically add the scripts, increasing the build automatically. As a bonus, I think you can use your SMO. And I'm just getting the database object here from our SQL Server SMO, and then use this deploy method to deploy the package without any other commands. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Carol. And up next, we have Joel.
Hey, guys. How's it going? I know you're not going to respond, but just making sure everyone can see my screen. Which I think you can. Yes, cool, awesome. All right, so I'm going to be talking about the PowerShell koans. If you find that word hard to say, that's fine, so do I. I'm probably mispronouncing it. Basically, this is an idea I ran across a while back while I was learning F#, as I actually note here in the repo. Basically, it's an idea that rather than reading 100 books on a language and then trying to code, you basically learn by immersion, where they drop you in and you attempt to find your way. Now, as I said, I learned F# in this method, and I found it quite effective. So I thought, why not make something for PowerShell? Turns out there actually is an existing PowerShell koans, but I found it a little lacking. So I was like, let me put something together and see what I can find. Basically, the idea stems from F#, then Ruby was the original one, I believe. And it actually comes from Eastern philosophy, where it's basically you meditate on a contradiction in order to reach an intuitive answer. That's kind of the idea. It's definitely not in spirit with the Eastern original philosophy, but it's a similar idea, tangential, you might say. So I'm just going to, with that, I'm just going to dive in and show you kind of how it looks. This is the GitHub repo, and I actually have the module installed already. There's some instructions on the GitHub on how to install it. That's not the correct command, but there you go. So we're going to actually just go ahead and I'll just run it once just so you can see the initial. And it basically just gives you a basic output, some flavor text, because why not be fun with it? And it will tell you something failed. This is what should have happened, and this is where it failed. And then it gives you a little note down the bottom that you can go ahead and do this, and it will go ahead and pull up either Windows Explorer if you don't have VS Code installed, or currently it will also pull up VS Code if it's installed and on your path. And it will pull up this folder, which contains a copy of all the koans test files. And if we check our little output here, we can see that it told us that we need to look in this file here, the about assertions koans. And if we look at that, it actually, for those of you who are familiar with Pester, it's in here, be very, very familiar with this, because this is literally just Pester with a little bit of flavor here and there to help me sort things and make it a little more interesting than just basic Pester output. I'm not going to need that right now. So basically, as it said, something failed. There was a test that we expected something, and it was wrong. In this case, it's pretty simple. I start very basic, just to get people used to the syntax. And you'll note that I have little blanks to fill in. And that's effectively just a custom function that just doesn't do anything to prevent PowerShell throwing syntax errors. And I mean, this isn't obviously going to be a walkthrough. I just want to kind of show you how it changes as you go ahead and solve a few. But effectively, if I go ahead and rerun, there's a few aliases for this. I'm a fan of Rake just because the original koans that I encountered used a build and deployment system called Rake to help run things. And as you'll see, it's changed. We're now on a different describe block. We are, once again, expecting true but got false. What a shame. And it will list exactly what happened. And then you'll also note, if you have been very fast, because I'm a little quick, I know, but actually this section here, just some flavor text. I actually dug up some old Zen koans and pulled a few little bits of interesting text that I found. And it will also tell you how far along you are. If it's at all important to you, that's not a count of the files you have to go through. That would be insane. That's actually a count of the individual it tests in Pester. I actually had a discussion with Joel Bennett on this one fairly recently, and he was very adamant that we should all just be using the new Gherkin syntax for Pester, but I don't agree. It's not simple enough, I think, for people still learning, whereas this Pester syntax is very similar to a DSL. It's not strictly, their commands aren't, the verb noun syntax, but it's very easy to understand. This is what's going on, and this is what should be happening. And if it's not, it's pretty clear why. You'll note these files aren't ordered, so you will have to do a bit of searching. I'm not really sure I'm 100% happy with that. This is partially a work in progress. I'm still working on filling out the collection of koans. As you'll notice, so I've gone from about assertions down to about variables, and there's a bunch more here. Now, these actually go on for quite a ways. I try to be fairly in-depth, but also skim through things quickly enough to not really lose interest and bore people. But there is quite a bit here, so I'm not going to cover all of it, obviously. I will go ahead and just pull up real quick. It's actually not available here, so don't worry about that. I was going to show you one of the internal functions, but essentially this count here, that's like a week's worth of work. Honestly, it's very difficult to get Pester to tell you how many tests it's running without actually running them. So That was fun, but yeah, basically it's just a learning module for people who either have to teach others PowerShell or who are just looking to learn. Because I found that PowerShell it's not unfriendly to new people. Its syntax is very friendly, but in terms of actually learning things, your options have pretty much just been read the documentation, read the help system, which is fantastic if you know it exists. And I actually have some pointers in here to that help system specifically because of that. There's an entire file here about get help, get member, and get command, because those three will basically teach you the most PowerShell you will ever know, apart from the really, really complex .NET stuff. But yeah, it's just really, PowerShell is centered a lot around books at the moment. So having something where you can learn PowerShell by being immersed in PowerShell code with annotated comments and just knowing what to expect in a sense, I found actually really helpful learning F#, and the initial comments from this has been pretty good. So I'm going to keep at it, and yeah, but thank you guys very much, and that's all I've got for you for now.
Awesome. Thanks, Joel. So I think that's actually everyone tonight. Seriously, thank you everyone for coming. Everyone who was like up at midnight and so forth. It was really cool. We have our next session scheduled for, I believe it's September 13th. We're still working out who's going to be speaking because several people have to drop out, but we have a pretty good lineup coming up. So I think we're good to go. Thanks, everyone.